This is Land of Havilah, 2 Chronicles 9, which describes some of Solomon's wealth and wisdom. Verse 1. When the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to test Solomon with hard questions at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, including camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. When she had come to Solomon, she talked with him about all that was in her heart. Solomon answered all her questions. There wasn't anything hidden from Solomon which he didn't tell her. When the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his ministers, their clothing, his cupbearers also, their clothing, and his ascent by which he went up to Yahweh's house, there was no more spirit in her. She said to the king, "It was a true report that I heard in my own land of your acts and of your wisdom. However, I didn't believe their words until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half of your greatness, of your wisdom, was not told me. You exceed the fame that I heard. Happy are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be Yahweh your God, who delighted in you to set you on his throne, to be king for Yahweh your God, because your God loved Israel, to establish them forever. Therefore he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness." She gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great abundance, and precious stones. There was never before such spice as the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. The servants of Huram and the servants of Solomon, who brought gold from Ophir, also brought algum trees and precious stones. The king used algum tree wood to make terraces for Yahweh's house and for the king's house, and harps and stringed instruments for the singers. There were none like these seen before in the land of Judah. King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all her desire, whatever she asked, in addition to that which she had brought to the king. So she turned and went to her own land, she and her servants. Comment in verse 1, the queen of Sheba visited Solomon. Sheba is unknown, but it was south because Jesus called her the queen of the south, Matthew 12:42 and Luke 11:31. Sheba must have been very distant because in verse 6, she felt her information about Solomon was more rumor than fact, and in verse 9 she brought spices with which the Israelites were unfamiliar. In verses 1 and 2, Solomon answered all her most difficult questions, which surely included transcendent questions about spirituality. In verse 1, the questions were in her heart. By the time Solomon answered everything in verse 9, she expressed belief in Yahweh, that he loved Israel, therefore he had blessed them with Solomon. In verse 2, she was completely satisfied with all his answers. This is according to what Yahweh told Solomon, quote, "Wisdom and knowledge is granted to you," 2 Chronicles 1:12. In verse 2, quote, "There wasn't anything hidden from Solomon," end quote. From the New Testament, quote, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given him," James 1:5. So there isn't anything hidden from us either. There's no need for any of us to pine away wondering about the deep questions of life. God will answer us. In verses 3 and 4, Solomon's wisdom extended to every practical matter, as evidenced by the things he built, his food, the way he instructed his servants to conduct themselves. In verse 4, there was no more spirit in the queen. She was overwhelmed. In verses 7 and 8, she knew it was a great boost to the people's morale to have a wise king. May God remove fools from us and set leaders in all positions to do justice and righteousness, as in verse 8. In verses 9 through 12, Huram, Solomon, and the queen gifted and traded with each other. The queen gave Solomon $242 million worth of gold at today's price, and he gave her some things that she admired and asked for. When some scribes asked Jesus to perform a miraculous sign to prove God was with him, he refused to perform a sign and explained why. Part of his answer was that if the queen of the south could discern Solomon's alignment with God, it should be even easier to discern his because he was greater than Solomon, Matthew 12:42. We haven't heard the last from the queen. Jesus said she would rise up on the day of judgment and condemn the scribes for being so blind to Jesus. Now about Solomon's wealth, which Yahweh promised to give him near the beginning of his reign. Verse 13. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, in addition to that which the traders and merchants brought. All the kings of Arabia and the governors of the country brought gold and silver to Solomon. Comment, verses 13 and 14, Solomon was taking in $1.34 billion worth of tribute from the kings he dominated, and he was bringing in more by trade. By the way, tribute isn't the same thing as robbery. Kings paying tribute could expect the king over them to protect them militarily. Judges 18:7. Coming up, there is no national debt in Israel. On the contrary, Solomon had to think of inventive ways to use all the gold he had lying around. Verse 15. King Solomon made 200 bucklers of beaten gold. 600 shekels of beaten gold went to one buckler. He made 300 shields of beaten gold. 300 shekels of gold went to one shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Comment, the house of the forest of Lebanon was the name Solomon gave to his palace, 1 Kings 7:2. It looked like a forest of Lebanon on the inside because of all the cedar pillars in it. Verse 17. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, with a footstool of gold which was fastened to the throne, an armrest on either side by the place of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests. 12 lions stood there on the one side and on the other on the 6 steps. There was nothing like it made in any other kingdom. Comment, just in case that went by too fast, his throne was ivory overlaid with gold. It had armrests, and the top of the backrest was rounded, 1 Kings 10:19. It sat on a platform. There were 6 steps leading up to the throne. There was a lion on each end of each step and a lion on each side of the throne, so 14 lions. There was a gold footstool attached to the throne so it didn't slide out when he put his feet on it. He was too smart to put up with constant aggravation with his feet sliding out. Verse 20. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. Silver was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. Comment, coming up, Tarshish is a distant port thought to be westward on the Mediterranean coast or on the African Atlantic coast. In verse 21, the ships that went there only made the trip once every 3 years, maybe because it took all that time to get there and back. Verse 21. For the king had ships that went to Tarshish with Huram's servants. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Comment, that fulfilled what Yahweh promised him in 2 Chronicles 1:12, riches and wisdom, that it would exceed all the kings of the earth. Verse 23. All the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom which God had put in his heart. They each brought tribute, vessels of silver, vessels of gold, clothing, armor, spices, horses, and mules every year. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen that he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. Comment, coming up the river in verse 26 is the Euphrates, which is 350 miles north. Verse 26. He ruled over all the kings from the river even to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedars to be as abundant as the sycamore trees that are in the lowland. They brought horses for Solomon out of Egypt and out of all lands. Comment, the narrative of Solomon has been following along very closely with that of 1 Kings. But between verse 28 that we just read and verse 29 that's coming next, 2 Chronicles omits almost all of 1 Kings 11. So we won't be hearing again of how Solomon's foreign wives influenced him to turn him away from the Lord when he was old. He began to worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Milcom and Molech, gods of the Ammonites, and Chemosh, the god of Moab. He built altars to all of them on the Mount of Olives, probably in the site of Yahweh's temple. There he sacrificed and burned incense to those foreign gods. Then Yahweh began to bring trouble on Solomon, and most consequentially, he told him that he would split the kingdom after he died. His son would reign over Judah only, and Jeroboam, son of Nebat, would reign over the rest of his former kingdom. So David's dynasty that ruled from the Euphrates to Egypt will be cut to a very small fraction of its size. Coming up, there used to be more information about Solomon in some books that are now lost. The last person who checked out those books from the library should return them immediately. Verse 29. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, first and last, aren't they written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Solomon slept with his fathers, and he was buried in his father David's city. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. Comment in verse 30, Solomon reigned 40 years, which is the same as father reigned, but his father was 7 plus 33, first over Judah, then over all Israel. In verse 31, when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took the throne. Rehoboam assumes he'll reign over all Israel, but as explained in the next chapter, he'll reign over Judah only, and Jeroboam, son of Nebat, will be king over the rest of it. Jeroboam's territory will be variously known as Israel, Samaria, and the northern kingdom. So if we think of the initials JR, the J for Jeroboam will be on the north, and the R for Rehoboam will be on the south. 2 Chronicles 10 is next.